Okay. All right. So this evening, Bob Dryja presents the first of two very interesting talks related to the ethics of science and religion. The title of his talk is Ethics for Science and Faith. Here's a short bio on Bob. Robert Dryja has lived in Los Alamos since 1996. Technically, he's an alien since he has not worked for the Los Alamos National Laboratory. Robert's 30-year work career has involved working through the country with hospitals and physicians to start new medical groups or restore medical groups in financial trouble. It was this background in medical group management that brought him to New Mexico. Although technically retired, he has continued interest in the management of health services. He is a board member of the Los Alamos Retirement Community and also member of the County Health Council. Robert has had a lifelong interest in the natural world. This started when he was a Cub Scout in what was the Panama Canal Zone. He watched for vampire bats at night from his jungle hammock. He was involved in the startup of the Peak Nature Center and now writes a monthly column called Amateur Naturalist. He also has interest in ethics as it applies to individuals, communities, and the natural world. This interest emerged while standing in the mud flats of a mangrove swamp in Panama, pondering how people should relate to one another. He has provided a lecture on ethics in the 2020 Faith and Science program. It can be seen at the Faith and Science Forum website and the 2020 abstracts. Okay, well, let's get started. I'll turn this now over to Bob and we'll monitor questions or comments coming in on chat for discussion later. I hope you enjoyed the talk. Let's see what I do. I'm going to do this and stop screen share. And somehow Bob's going to get on the air.
Okay, now I don't want to stir things. I'm going to hit share screen.
Yes, hit share screen. Yes, try that.
Will Susan get all upset?
No, I don't think we'll get upset.
Okay, I see it on my side here.
Yeah, there it is. There it is.
Are
Good.
people seeing it okay on their ends?
Oh, yeah, sure.
Okay. I decide I must look like that robot right now, trying to get all this machinery to work correctly. Anyway, good evening to everybody, and looking forward to having a presentation and some discussion about the idea of ethics having a particular attribute of being able to help both science and faith together. I'm going to try and get this thing to do something different. Okay, now I can see more of my screen. Okay, right there. So my discussion is on ethics for science and faith. And let's see if it moves on. Oh, and then I come down here, she told me. Okay, it had showed something earlier. There we go. I'm learning how to use PowerPoint on Zoom. Wonderful stuff. Anyway, the purpose of this evening is to try and review how faith and science can reinforce one another. And this reinforcement can be done by the use of ethics. That is a central core idea. In getting into it, when you get into the history of how science and faith relate, there's typically been four different points of view, four ways of trying to interrelate them. The first one that catches the most attention possibly is the idea there's inherently conflict between the two. Two key underlying themes for conflict are that on one side is the assertion that the universe is static. It really hasn't changed ever since its creation, whether you talk about 6,000 years ago or 6 billion years ago. And that contrasts with science that typically is looking at all sorts of things that evolve over time. So that's been one possible source of conflict if people insist on static versus evolving. A second one is looking at the Bible as a literal, complete statement of truth, whereas science is always taking anything and doing more of a detailed and more detailed interpretation of what's going on. So that's when you're trying to look at faith and science and saying, oops, they've got problems. The second one is to simply say there are two completely different ways of looking at the world. They're independent of one another. Faith is looking at immediate personal relationships among people, where science is a little more detached and analytical. Just two different ways of approaching a particular situation. Other way is saying that faith looks at is a way of life involving shared stories, rituals, and practices, where science is more concerned with prediction and control of what will happen in the future. The second one starts to overcome those two earlier ones, talking about dialogue. Basically, each side raises questions, but not necessarily gets to helping one another and answering them. So science can raise questions that it can't answer, and these typically relate to why are things ordered the way they are? What's something called beauty? Why is the universe complex? So science has these questions that it's not able to answer directly. Faith likewise raises questions on how to apply principles. How do you apply a faith value to a specific situation that can be complex? So you talk about it, but not necessarily get something done. One we're looking at this evening is the fourth one, where you actually try and integrate them together. If you can bring both science and faith together somehow, then we would have a more complete view, a more coherent view of what's going on in the world. So that's our starting point. How do we integrate? And in particular, looking at a little more at it, is we can say that if you take faith and add it to science, then you begin to get a broader understanding of science issues. If you can somehow take science and add it to faith, then you start to get deeper understanding of faith issues. They add breadth and depth to one another when they can come together. This tries to visualize it a little bit, where you actually integrate it. If you take faith and ethics, if you say a part of faith is ethics, what's appearing, if I can get this to on this side, if you can take the ethics component from faith and combine it with science, instead of science being by itself, it broadens out into a better understanding of what's going on. If I go and look at science, you have science theory, but science has results that, again, if it can take those results and all and tie them into faith, then together you're getting a deeper understanding of what's going on for some particular situation. Oops, got to get to the right button here. How does this process work of bringing them together? Well, it turns out that both science and faith can be saying they involve a process that has four structures to it. They both, because it's circular, have to start somewhere. You could say, in a sense, they both start, whether you're looking at faith or science, they both involve imagination, analogies, and models when you're looking at a situation. Now, what happens with science is based on those imaginations and models, then you move a little more concretely to having concepts and theories. And then based on a theory, then you go out and start getting at data and say, does the data support your theory? And then it can feed back to further strengthen, change what you're imagining or modeling. However, this is not always direct. You may have some concepts and theories, but these theories are influenced by your observations. And those observations then are the type of data you get can influence things. So there's this cycle of what goes on and on. We usually start out thinking of science as going from theory to data, but actually lurking in the sequence is the imagination of something, and then your particular view theories influencing your data. Now, will this work? Yes. An example of this is when you look at, I like to always go to the Pythagorean theorem. Surely everybody from sophomore year of high school taking geometry learned about the Pythagorean theorem. Einstein takes it and runs and uses it as part of his theory of space-time. None of my math teachers brought up space-time as part of the theory of relativity. But Einstein was able to come along and say, as things go faster, time slows down. And if you wanted to have a nice reading of it, go to a book by John Wheeler, A Journey into Gravity and Space-Time, and he has a nice discussion for a person who doesn't have a big math background on how Einstein takes the Pythagorean theorem and it uses as a basis for his theory of relativity. So that's where imagination can really take things. However, again, that idea that how you're observing changes things, again, when I took plane geometry, everything was two-dimensional. Parallel lines never intersected in a two-dimensional situation. However, when you go into three-dimensional spheres, guess what happens? Things change. And instead of staying always separate, parallel lines always intersect if you're having them be on a sphere. So depending on how you're approaching your thinking, your model can or cannot go in two different directions with geometry. So keep that in mind as we go forward. Faith likewise has a similar way of looking at things where it goes through 4 steps. Again, we could say person starts with imagination and models, but then instead of going to theories, a person basically develops concepts or beliefs, and particularly the word beliefs, based on what he imagines the universe is all about. These beliefs, in turn, are influenced by the experiences a person has and how he interprets them. Those, in turn, those religious experiences lead into stories and ritual that go back into here. In a way, this is all a series of deductive steps where science has both deductive and deductive and deductive reasoning. So let's take a little further here. Faith is basically using deductive logic. It's using deductive logic to think about how people experience, about the experiences people have. Those experiences in turn lead to further deductions of stories and rituals as part of faith services at a church for it there. So faith is very much deductive based. Science, on the other hand, also includes inductive. It may start with a deductive idea, something imaginative like Einstein thinking about space-time, but then it goes on and says, we've got to get some data. Now, does this idea really work? So science gets experimental to evaluate if induction is correct. So induction leads to deduction. Now, let's try and apply that to a situation that's rather current in today's world of science, and that relates to something called the CRISPR gene editing. CRISPR has really taken off in all sorts of directions in doing biological research. It's a technique for going into cells right down to the nucleus and the DNA and modifying it if you want to see what happens with the modified DNA. You can come along and take existing genes, you can remove them, you can add new ones. It's easy to do with high precision and relatively easy to do in today's world. The hope is you can create new medicines, new agricultural products, and modify an organism with its genes. And when you talk about modifying organisms, you think particularly in the medical world, they think about a person who has some sort of mutation, some inherited disease, to genetically change them so those inherited diseases or mutations go away. Sounds good, doesn't it? Okay. That's CRISPR editing. So science is basically saying we can bring about with CRISPR immediate changes in the individual, or if we get enough people, we can change the future characteristics of whole populations. And that is taking science forward, all with technique. But notice there's nothing discussed about at this point about ethics. Now, faith comes along and says, is this really all that good? Now this is an imaginative question for belief. Is a person more than the sum of his parts? How far can you go in making small changes in a person before he's completely different? Remember that robot at the opening scene? Could you change a person so much that he's a robot? I seem to remember a TV show, Star Trek, and there's a guy in it called Commander Data. He was a robot, although he looked like a person. You can take this even further. Suppose you do enough things about your beliefs, but then a story. What is your story about what makes a human a human? How far can you go adding genes to another creature like a monkey? And that's occurring right now. Let's see what happens for changing this particular gene in a monkey, because maybe we can change that gene in a human as well, hopefully for the better. So if you use belief and story, you can be a little more cautious in your thinking about what can CRISPR do. It's not just technique, it's what is it doing to people in a big way. CRISPR can go further. Probably some of you have heard about the Tuskegee study back going into the 1930s. A group of people had syphilis. They're trying to figure out how good antibiotics were. So you had a group of people who were left untreated for 40 years just to see how bad syphilis affected them compared to people who were treated. Well, is that such a good idea? Experience suggests that perhaps science can come up with some pretty bad experiments. In contrast to that, you can take a look at the polio vaccine. I can remember it when it came out in the 1950s. One round, you got an injection to your arm. All us boys as early teenagers are worried that we were going to faint in front of the girls. The next version came along, you took it as a sugar cube. But polio vaccine is considered to be overall a good scientific result. And then we look at today's world. We're going through the treatment of the COVID endemic. And if you look at vaccinating older people, this is going back when vaccines were just started to be developed, there's a proposal that older people should be vaccinated first over younger people. But when you're looking at a person who's already 80, 90 years old, do you want to be vaccinating them when they're probably going to be dying in a short period of time? You've got a real ethical issue to work through there. So when you start applying faith, science can be looked upon as being good, it can be looked as bad, it can be looked upon as uncertain. Now, let's take it forward. Where do we go from here? There's a couple of ways of looking at ethics. And one way is saying ethics can be outward looking. What's going on out there? Something that is a direction out there. And typically you can see, particularly for historical faith commands, there's codes, there's precepts, there's commands depending on which faith you look at. So the one I always like for a code is a code of Hammurabi, an eye for an eye. You've probably all heard that. A broken bone for a broken bone. If you break somebody's arm, your arm should be broken in turn. When you look at people, I always wonder how much a gold mina is, but you pay 1 gold mina for the eye of a free person. On the other hand, if it's a slave, you only pay half as much. Slaves aren't worth as much as regular folks. If we go to Taoism, this begins to look a little bit familiar. You know, Taoism, first precept, don't kill people, don't steal from them, no sexual misconduct, no false speech, no taking of intoxicants. We'd be in big trouble if Taoism was serious in today's world in the United States. Don't go out drinking for it there. But this begins to look somewhat similar to the 10 Commandments. You can take the 10 Commandments and break them into a set of 4 that are basically saying how you should relate to God. And then you have another 6 that basically are concerned about how do you relate to people. So honor your father and mother. Don't kill anybody. No adultery. Don't steal. Don't have false witness against anybody. And don't covet stuff. And this is looking at relationships among people as your approach to ethics. Now, I'm trying to get my thing to work here. On the other hand, there's another way of approaching ethics, and instead of looking out for, I'll call it rules coming from the outside, you can look at ethics when you look inside yourself. How should I be thinking about myself? How should I be behaving? And they can break into three major categories. There's the virtues, there's being compassion, a variety of compassions, and a variety of things that you need internally to have a ethical life. So the four moral virtues, probably all of us have heard about Aristotle, and idea that you inside yourself develop certain attitudes on how to look at the world. You develop certain good habits inside your house on how to control your behavior, your passions, your conduct. So you're prudent. You have consciously trying to have things be justice. You're willing to, come on, I love this mouse. You're willing to hang in there to get things done. You're willing to not go to extremes for it. So that's Aristotle as a starting point for ethics coming from inside yourself. Other people that you can read more currently, there's a lady named Karen Armstrong who's written a book calling The 12 Steps to a Compassionate Life. This is looking inside yourself and how to have a better life. And these are all basically ethical. You learn how to be compassionate. You learn to look inside yourself. You learn to be understanding and caring of yourself. Empathy, mindfulness, action. And then she's got these cautions, how little we actually know. How should we talk to other people? How should we show concern for other people? How do we get knowledge? And of course, love thy enemy. So she's developing a way of how should I be inside myself, not waiting for some rule from outside. Elaine Uckland, she actually did a presentation the other year for the Faith and Science, and she breaks out 8 things. On one hand, she notices that good scientists are also curious. They question, they look for a healing effect of their science, and they stand impressed by what science has done. How is a natural world existing? She then has another 4 that she has here, this humility, creativity, shalom, and gratitude. That again are involving certain ways of feeling and thinking about yourself that are part of this other set of thinking and feeling about yourself. Fun one for me was when I was doing all this research, I came across the 10 commandments for computer ethics. And the ones that particularly caught my attention for this evening is, guess what? You don't use a computer to harm people, and you don't use it to steal things. I'm thinking about all the hackers now that are out there, all the stuff that's making the national news about people trying to break in and do in all sorts of businesses. You won't put in bogus information, be a false witness to things occurring, and you think about the consequence of what your programming is doing. You always use your computer to be respecting other people. And this comes from an article by a guy named Ramon Markin, In Pursuit of the 10 Commandments. And it's interesting how he comes along and applies them to computers back in 1992. This all came out. Well, think about where the world is today for computer usage. Suppose people who are good technically with computers also took to heart these set of commandments, plus the others that I don't mention here. Our computer world might be very different than the one we see today. Would the current problems with the internet usage be the same if people took computer ethics seriously? When that came out, people took it as a kind of a joke. Well, maybe it's not so much of a joke today. Now, are closing. We probably have all heard of St. Asimov and his 4 laws relating to computers. Again, thinking back to that robot that we saw at the opening screen, he basically says there are 4 laws. He starts out with the 0 one. Can you tell this is a guy coming off a math background? He doesn't start with 1, he starts with 0. Robots will not harm humanity by action or inaction to come to harm. A robot will not injure a human being through inaction or allow a human being to come to harm. A robot will obey orders from a human, given that those orders won't mess with the first law. Somebody else doesn't tell you to do something bad, and you say, well, I didn't choose to do it, somebody else told me. And the third one is a robot protects their own existence as long as it's not going to cause any trouble for people being harmed directly or indirectly. So that's applying ethics in the 21st century. I've reached the end for my part of the talk, and this is a set of questions I'm going to leave up. They're meant to be helping the people who are listening in, and they're just meant to help us on our thinking here. So for me, I was thinking if I was sitting as a watcher and could get together several people to discuss things, I'd be saying, okay, of the many kinds of science, biology, chemistry, physics, sociology, psychology, where is ethics the most directly important of the many types of sciences? Does it stand out as being more important in one than the other? I just went through CRISPR it's in the area of biology. So in my mind, ethics in biology research today is very, very high. Where are we going with biological research and how will it affect the future of humanity? Person who's got a background in chemistry or in physics may have some additional ideas. My background tends to get into biology. Then if you move forward a little bit from the science field to an application area, should ethics be in medicine? Well, again, with a biological background, where medicine is going in terms of ethics, it's up there. But you can move it along and saying, what's the ethics of chemical engineering? We could talk about computers being hacked with, what's happening with communication technology. And then we talk about global warming, what's happening to all sorts of animals, plants going extinct, possibly in the natural world. How do we come along and say, where is ethics importance and the importance of different areas? Another sort of question area for people in the audience to be thinking about. And then to go, the next step is we've talked about faith being important to science, but now how can science help faith? How can science help us have a better degree of trustworthiness in biblical events from the past? How do we take science to help us see those in a positive way, not say reject them? How do we take the 10 commandments or the 6 that I listed? How do we come along and take science and help people of faith take commandments and use them better thanks to the insights, the detailed knowledge that science can provide for specific situations? And that just about covers it for me. I'll leave this here. Does anybody, unfortunately, I can't see it from my screen here, but Dan, if you can,
Yeah, okay.
if anybody's got questions or something coming in, perhaps we can start looking at the questions if anybody has any.
Yeah, well, thanks, Bob, for a great talk. I mean, very, very, very interesting questions that you raised. And we do have some questions in the chat. And I think Susan is, Susan, are you reading these chat questions out?
Sure, I'll start off with a couple of them.
Okay.
Okay, we have one from Gary. He says, that was an excellent and diverse set of ethical values that seem to have great overlap. Was there a common point of origin? Are there other sets you did not mention that are orthogonal to the set you see as ethical? Nazi Germany, DPRK, Plato's Republic, the Communist Manifesto, etc.
That could be worked into, but for getting this presentation, unfortunately, I didn't get into those type of topics. Gary, you're going to have to do a presentation on them. But I can't give a good answer to those, unfortunately.
Well, Bob, my point was that you chose a set that we are empathetic with.
Right.
But there are others who have sets of what they term to be ethics that
Okay.
we find very uncomfortable. And
Okay.
and as we're getting into an increasingly technically powerful world, the question is there an anchor that tells us which set of ethics are the right ones?
Okay, so if I back up at the example of Nazi Germany coming along and talking about being the supreme race, let's get rid of all these other inferior human species, all of the concentration camps and stuff. That was their ethics. Is that sort of what you're getting at?
Yeah, for example, or in Plato's Republic, he talks about very strong control of the state over the people to provide stability, which you might find reflected in Mao's Red Book.
Right.
Those are different sets of values, and they kind of go across the ones that you listed as being virtuous.
Okay. Well, what happened for me, I was trying to work from, I guess I'll say I was coming from a traditional Western Christian point of view. I see what you're getting at. I think what any person would face, if I'm getting at your question, is you have to decide, is my particular approach, like what I presented here with the commandments and all, or the other ones that I presented, a person have to decide, are those valid? Do they take priority over something else, like to be run by a government is better than to say you have to make decisions personally. I think you'd have to say, which one do you feel is the most valid? And I think people could have different arguments one way or the other as to which they think is the best.
Bob, what I'm hoping that you're going to come to is God revealed a certain set that are fundamentally good, and there's a whole bunch of others that may not be. So if we look to Revelation, that gives us a guide.
Oh, and I came at it looking at what was going on with these different other religions. At the very beginning for it there. I just approached it differently, and unfortunately, I didn't explore it the way you're explaining right now.
And Bob, we have a similar question from Maury. Says, are you familiar with the natural law ethic?
I've read about the natural law ethic, and one of my references does get into discussing I'll call it the natural world or natural laws.
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking of it, and that'll pop up when I open up the next screen that shows possible references.
Okay. Shall we go on to the next question?
Okay.
And we have a question from Catherine. How can the CRISPR be policed worldwide? The world seems very atheistic.
Well, this is sort of interesting. I've thought about this one. What has happened is within, and this is where ethics has gotten into biology to a greater degree than ever was when I was in college. But there are some folks over in China doing some CRISPR activity that once it came out, all of the biology folks around the world were saying this is unethical, because this particular bit of CRISPR work was modifying an organism in a way that was considered to be highly unethical. So I'd say right now what's happening through science talking to science or scientists talking to scientists, there is some movement, but I have not seen anything for international law or religions from different areas, Muslim and Christian, for example, getting together and saying, what would be the ethical way to do biological research? It seems like it's the researchers themselves that are giving themselves some guidelines.
I might add that the Chinese government, which is fairly atheistic, put the guy in jail
Yeah.
We have a comment from Eric. A book recommendation for mathematical ethics, Weapons of Mass Destruction by Kathy O'Neill, discusses unintended consequences of various models, statistical analysis, design of financial instruments, etc. Eric, do you want to expound on that?
Yeah, it's not mass destruction, it is math destruction.
Math destruction. Okay, you know,
So she's a mathematician and she used to work doing statistical analysis. I think she was involved with rating teachers. And then she saw how not analyzing data sets well enough, teachers were getting given bad grades basically because their data sets were so small that the variance from year to year, a teacher could go from being a great teacher to a bad teacher just by statistical differences in the testing technique. And then she worked in the financial industry for a while and helped make toxic financial instruments, which led to 2000. Anyway, I think she wrote this book, and I think she's now teaching math in college. But anyway, it's an interesting book that, it talks about how loans were given and how redlining works and using zip codes to predict whether a person can pay their loans and the unintended consequences of those things. And so all of these are sort of mathematical models that you set out in the world. And if you fly totally by instruments, you do things that don't look very nice sometimes. And so, it's sort of important to have a person in there looking at what you're flying by instruments is doing and try to correct those things. It's an interesting book.
Is this a point where I can go on to my references? Next slide. Is this a good time, Susan?
Absolutely. That's the end of the questions, I believe, and we'll wait for people to, to ask additional questions as you show your references.
Mm-hmm. Just to give a quick review of the references, that Ian Barber, Religion and Science, that's the one that goes through that 4-part circular logic for how faith and science work for thinking through things. The thing about time, space, and Pythagorean theorem, that's John Wheeler in his book called A Journey into Gravity and Space-Time. Then Ramon with his In Pursuit of the 10 Commandments for Computers. And then for getting some real in-depth, looking at ethics within yourself, Karen Armstrong's 12 Steps and Elaine Eklund's Why Faith and Science Teach Each Other. And then I added an extra couple that I just found personally interesting to start reading, the John Hoyt book on science and religion, going from conflict to conversation. And Francis Crick, you may remember him, developing DNA, and him coming along and saying the astonishing hypothesis, scientific search for the soul. So a guy who was into molecular cellular work started thinking about the soul. So these are interesting people to read.
We do have a couple of more questions, if I may read them to you. We have one from Vicky. What about use of artificial intelligence in ethical decision-making? Can there be ethics if no humans are involved?
Using computers for ethical decision-making. Well, that gets back to, when you modify a person far enough, when does it become a robot? Or how far do you go in developing the circuitry in a robot that he's in effect a human? I would think that when you're looking at this inward ethics, whether you got advice from a computer or whether you got advice from a religious person, a minister, you need to step back and think for yourself. What is the appropriate way to go, rather than simply say somebody else told me to do it. When I was putting together my notes, I have the thing about somebody comes along and says, I don't steal stuff because if I steal stuff, God will send me to hell. If there's no God, I'd be out stealing things. That's that outer directive. Other people come along and say, stealing is just flat wrong. I would not personally choose to steal. That's that inward looking. And so that's sort of robot on the outside, inward looking, where you're considering something yourself. I hope that helps.
We have a comment from Chick. He goes, religions put forth ethics, morality as absolutes. Modern people have moved at times from absolutes, purveying relative ethics based on the situation. Which is the better approach? Does a belief in an after work change what actions we think are ethical?
Something after work?
Yeah, I'm not, Chick, you want to explain that part of your question? Maybe you meant afterlife. Does a belief in afterlife change what actions we think are
Or
ethical?
after,
He's not hearing us. He's still muted.
Probably muted.
Chick, can you unmute yourself? There we go.
That's world, not work.
Okay. Okay, hi, I'm reading work.
Sorry
I'll
about
change
that.
it to world.
Life after death,
Yes.
Okay,
where
so
there'll be a reckoning.
so the question again, now that we know we're talking about the world.
Okay, so religions put forth ethics, morality as absolutes. Modern people have moved at times from absolutes, purveying relative ethics based on the situation. Which is the better approach? And does a belief in life after death change what actions we think are ethical?
Well, I would say that to the degree that you think there's some sort of life after death and you can be punished in that afterlife for doing bad things, then I would say a certain number of people change their behavior, anticipating what might happen after they die. But if they did not have that particular belief in a particular afterlife, they would have to say, am I doing things impulsively? Should I still follow some commandments because I personally believe in them, not because I believe somebody expects me to follow them?
Mhm, mhm.
Does that help a little bit?
But the first question is I think substantive. The difference between what I would call relative ethics and religion, which makes ethics, as my Irish mother used to say, right's right and wrong's nobody, absolute ethics. Is there a difference? And if there is, which one do you think is most productive?
Say it again so I'm following the thought. I'm having a little trouble thinking it through.
Religions put forth ethics and morality as absolutes.
Mhm.
Modern people have moved at times from absolutes to ethics based on a situation, relative situation. Which is the better approach?
Okay, I'm thinking back to where I had that 4 different approaches, and the first one was a conflict between science and religion. And the source of the conflict in part is taking certain, I'll say, religious statements and saying they're absolutely correct. There's nothing more to consider. I think a person who does that in today's world, where there's more and more recognition of the complexities, to be absolute in taking a particular sentence out of a scripture and saying, that's it, there's nothing more. That's not the way to go in today's world. I see people saying, let's take the subtleties that are available, are the broad statements of ethics in religion, and let's get to some depth with it by doing the analysis with science.
I think, this is Vicky. I think this discussion is about what we might consider Kant's categorical imperative, an absolute ethical statement, which is a still valid ethical principle today. The one being that people are ends in themselves and not means. I think that doesn't have a specific religious background to it. And I think that is a pretty widespread ethical absolute. And then we get into the situational ethics involving the application of what we want to believe are absolute principles. Most religious systems that I'm familiar with do not, there's a limited core of what we might call ethical statements, and they have to do with belief in one or more deities. When it comes to human interactions, whether that's human to human, human to God, human to natural world, we're much more in the realm of situational ethics. As you say, when we look at the subtleties or the depths or the context or the situation of this, much of what people want to consider as moral, religious moral absolutes devolve into situational ethics when we actually try to apply them. There are very few moral or ethical absolutes.
Okay.
We have another question from Gary. It says, it has been observed that a free market economy depends on the belief of individuals in honesty and accountability to God. Without that, it is said that the cost of policing transactions and preventing dishonesty would break the system and makes economies in atheistic societies unworkable. A Russian colleague told me, I am a thief in a society of thieves. Comment?
Oh, boy.
Okay, Bob, you ever shopped on eBay? It has nothing to do with accountability to God and everything to do with people being honest in their business transactions, and it does not break the system. Does it?
Well, I begin to think of last couple of presentations about the way Western world changed from being clans and everything based on your relationship to other members of your clan, to being far more outward looking and trusting of people who are at a distance, or Amazon really at a distance.
Mm-hmm.
So the comment was made by a Chinese scholar who was visiting the Harvard Business School. And after several years in the US, his departing comment to Clayton Christensen was that economics don't work where there is not an accountability. And my experience in dealing within communist and other markets in which there is not a belief in honesty. So for example, some will say that in Islam, you only have to be honest to your friends and to your co-believers, but other people not so much. And so if you're dealing with something like that, when somebody makes an assertion about usability or marketability, you need to have then some certification that says, we've inspected that and it's true, not just that somebody said it.
Okay, we have
So-
go ahead, Bob.
Okay, I was just going to say this, Was that person then asserting that the communist system in China or over in Russia is the better way to go for ethics?
No, I don't think so. I think that what they're saying is that the costs of doing business are much higher.
Okay.
I have a hard time believing Wall Street is worried about God at all. I'm sorry.
Well, Eric, the
No.
rest of us hold Wall Street accountable to those standards, even if they are not. And so everybody's looking at those
But I think they're more worried about getting caught.
Yeah, that's true.
So I don't think they're worried about what they're doing is ethical. I think they're worried about getting caught doing something wrong.
But there
Ethics
is a
and Bitcoins.
baseline of right and wrong in the society.
I think right and wrong is getting fined or getting people to argue with you and not buy any of your product because you're doing something wrong. I think it's all financial, but that's probably my sadistic view. But I have a real hard time believing that God's involved in Wall Street.
Well, I doubt that we can solve that at the moment, but we do have
Other than it says on the back of the dollar bill that in God we trust, I guess. But
That's right. We do have a comment from Maury, changing the topic just a little. With regard to Vicky's question using AI in a health insurance situation, who do you spend limited funds on?
Is this for Maury to talk about?
Maury, do you want to elaborate?
Well, I see that Catherine has followed that up with and who decides how the unlimited healthcare funds are spent. So is AI the way to go in determining which procedures health insurance pays for?
Oh boy, right there. To me, there's like two different worlds. We can have sort of the discussion we're having now, but I'm thinking of situations that I get involved with where somebody has an aging parent in a nursing home, and they're having to decide what to do about a frail, aging mother or father, and it's moving from nursing home into hospice, and making that decision that we're really getting down to the last weeks of that. When you get in that type of situation, it's very, very different on how to make decisions compared to what we're talking about here. How do you deal with a dying parent?
Well, that's
You just
totally
die?
different from what I was saying. I suppose you are administering the ACA and you want to know what you will, what procedures, what operations, what surgeries you will fund and to what level. How do you decide that?
Oh. Well, I suspect in today's world that there's a lot of falling back on data processing algorithms, and the data suggests here's the answer. But the data is always changing as more and more information becomes available. So I suspect at one point in time, you would say, let's go this way, let's cover it. Or at a different time, you'd say, no, let's not cover it. It's going to be very expensive with no real use coming out of it.
And there's a comment from Vicky. She's referencing the Quran. The Quran references for comment about, I may not be saying this correctly. The Quran references for comment about need to be honest only to other Muslims. What are you trying to say there, Vicky? Because
The statement was made, it wasn't in the chat, the statement was made that in Islam, Muslims only have to be honest to other Muslims, to members of their faith. I dispute that. I want to know what the Quran reference was for the basis for that statement.
So
that's-
Vicky, after you posted that, this is Gary. After you posted that, I did a quick web search, and what I find is that there is significant debate online, with some saying that if it furthers Muslims' religious objectives, that a lie to an infidel is okay. And there are others who say, no, 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 honesty is paramount for Islam. So I think that the answer depends on which side which horse you'll ride, which side you get on.
That's the end of the comments in the chat. So I'll pass it back to Dan and Bob for any other comments that people may have.
Yeah, okay,
I had a comment.
sure.
You were talking about AI and whether it should decide or someone else. And I know that Yuval Harari from Sapiens book, he commented that AI would be the best. Of course, you've still got to get your data in there. You don't know which data is getting in, but because it's not biased. And we all, it's human nature to have biases in our subconscious. So he was in favor of AI making these decisions.
Stephen Hawking argued exactly against that.
Oh,
saying
yeah?
You have to have a person involved. He was, Hawking was just appalled by the growing use of artificial intelligence.
Uh-huh.
Because
Read Weapons of Math Destruction. But-
And just a comment to that, from when I was a very young attorney, I worked at NASA, and there was the debate of whether we continue manned space flight, or if we're going to start to do more what today we would call robotic space flight, non-manned space flight. And the discussion was pretty deep and pretty heavy. And the fly-by-wire guys, if I can put it that way, just would not trust their mission to a computer. And they said a human has to be able to make a decision and pull upon and call upon different strengths to solve a problem. And that is continued in their dialogue to this day. So I think that's, it's always impressed me that the value they put on the human mind was more valuable than some of the computers that were coming about at the time. Just a thought.
Some of you may have seen articles about Danny Handelman's recent book about data use. And Handelman and his colleague Abe, what's Abe's last name?
Tversky.
Right. So Handelman and Abe, remind me again, Joyce.
Pardon?
His name again?
Kahneman, Danny Kahneman and Amos Tversky.
Tversky. Anyway, they noticed that people were very biased in their decision making, often making decisions without adequate data and thinking that they were making good decisions. So Handelman was arguing that many decisions, such as decisions about medical treatment and so on, should be based on data and be done by algorithm because it was right most of the time. He and Tversky did their early work doing analysis in the Israeli military, trying to figure out how people made decisions and what were good decisions. And they found that people's intuition often failed them because there were so many other things that insert themselves between the brain and the data, biases and experiences and so on.
Well, algorithms also have their own problems. So, you know, I mean, you can make an algorithm which will predict who should get a loan, and then you'll end up for that prediction will imply will give loans to people that they think can pay back the loans, and therefore you're excluding whole sections of the community from getting loans.
Well, that's logical.
It's logical until you can't get a loan because you're in the wrong zip code. You know, I really do recommend that book. It talks about a whole bunch of cases where there are a bunch of unintended consequences from trusting models to the extent of that's how you have to get your answers.
Well, it was you that said you have to be careful on what data you use for the algorithm. And if it's zip code, maybe that's not the right data.
Agreed, but you have to use something, and you end up using something, and then you find out that you're skewing where you're putting the money so that somebody else is not getting it.
Eric, I had
for the wrong reason.
Eric, I had some familiarity with the issue of evaluating teachers based on their class performances. I used to be on the school board here, and we got involved with a statistician from the lab, and the state was actually willing to give us the data they were using, and our bottom line was that it was too noisy, way too noisy to be making evaluations decisions. And I was involved in that, and indeed it was too noisy.
Yeah.
But I mean, that's using statistics correctly to say that it is too noisy, don't use this.
Yeah, but if you fly only by saying, well, we're going to use this test, and you never look at the statistics, you end up going down the wrong path. You know, I mean, that was the first chapter in Weapons of Math Destruction. So
There was a time when we were supplying intelligence systems to the Marine Corps, and they were really excited because they wanted all of their intelligence data to show up on a display for the commander to use in making decisions. And it was not very long before the commanders realized that the amount of data that was available to throw up on their screens was far more than they could assimilate or understand. And then the question was, okay, so which data do you throw out? How do you decide which is the important element? You know, if the answer is James Bond just came onto the field of battle, that should be very important, right? But maybe
well, that's the beauty of being human, and also the curse.
This reminds me about having to use your imagination to come up with a theory, and then realizing your particular approach is it's plane geometry or curvilinear geometry. You get two different answers depending on which model of math you use.
Yeah.
You know, I think one of the big reasons for having a very diverse workforce is that you get a lot of different points of view. One of the secrets of the laboratory is they hire a whole bunch of different kinds of people, and they look at problems not only from a physicist's point of view, but they even hired a mathematician to work in an explosives group, you know, and they look at problems differently. And
I think I noticed that some people felt like we got our morals and our ethics from the gospel, or some kind of gospel, some religion told us. And other people are thinking we get our morals and values from science, from reason. And I know neuroscientists, I think they're called, or cognitive scientists, they're saying that our morals and values came through us by natural selection. that our minds evolve just like our physical characteristics, and that we have different minds. And a big difference between, say, conservative mindset and a liberal mindset is that a conservative, they found they have, well, different brain structures are different sizes, and maybe like the amygdala in general is larger in a person with a conservative mindset. And so they might be more easily triggered by fear. Fear would trigger them. And so they have a different way of looking at the world because of natural selection, not because of what God told us or because of what we didn't get there by reason too often. In fact, right here, this is by Leonard Madloff. He wrote Hawking's last two books with him, Stephen. And he's a Caltech physicist, but he's writing about neuroscience. And he says, your unconscious mind rules your behavior. He's got a whole book on that. Your unconscious mind is the part of nature in your that's unconscious, and they're telling us it determines our moral values.
Joyce, could you put that in the chat, the name of that book, please?
Shoah. And actually, y'all know, if you go to yourmorals.org, they'll tell you by asking a few quick questions, it takes maybe 30 minutes to sign in, yourmorals.org, and that'll tell you about your morals. I don't know how morals and ethics relate, but they're inside chat. There it is. Old Madloff has 3 really good books on neuroscience.
Is that the simple way of saying that God will write his laws on your heart, i.e., e.g., in your DNA?
Oh my, what a thought.
Stanislaus Dehaene, in his book on consciousness and unconsciousness, takes a slightly different point of view. He said unconsciousness, what it really does is it looks at many, many hundreds of different possibilities from the data you took up, and it presents to the conscious just a few. And then with your decision making, which shows you have free will, you choose one of those. So the unconscious does affect what you get to choose, because it only presents to you certain, based on experience and your thinking and everything else, and your values, certain alternatives, and then you choose them. But it doesn't do the choosing for you. Once it's done that part of the job, you consciously decide.
Wouldn't Hawking's and those guys say that we have no free will?
Well, if you look at Dehaene's work with, all the different ways you look at the brain and stimulate it and everything else, he essentially says, of course you have free will. That's what the conscious does. The unconscious chooses the most likely alternatives, and the consciousness chooses the ones that it thinks is the best based on its experience and everything else. So you have lots of free will. A lot of things are determined. Lots of things are determined, but not everything, especially when you think about things for a long time.
Type that into the chat quick. Before I forget.
Dehaene's
No,
book?
I was just kidding you. That was great. I fuss over that a lot.
My cat has free will. The mouse in my garage has free will. Everybody's making choices all the time.
Those are unconscious choices from fear. That mouse is running, he didn't make a conscious decision to run. It was in his unconscious mind to survive. Natural selection will select him because he has a lot of fear.
He picks the grain that looks most delicious to him.
You think so?
I'm pretty sure my dog has free will. He makes lots of decisions, looking at what's going on with us and everything else, and you can see the dog thinking about it.
The fly that's
Yeah.
buzzing in the window is making choices all the time based on input and trying to optimize its situation.
But are they conscious decisions or is it a reaction?
Why would
Like
you?
Buddha always says, don't react. We can react unconscious in our subconscious is just react to an emotion like fear and run, react. But Buddha says, pause, think about it. And that means take it out of your subconscious mind and put it into your conscious mind. Think for a minute and make a conscious decision, not react. And that's what Kahneman and Tversky's book's all about, thinking fast and slow. Are you going to react or are you going to pause and put it into your conscious mind and think about it a minute?
And the right answer always is Rocky Road ice cream, Joyce.
You got it.
On that note,
Yes, on that note, I think we should wrap up here. Bob, again, thank you for sharing your thoughts and a great talk, and for all of you who've stayed on to make comments and suggestions. If you have further comments about this evening's presentation, you can share them on our website, or there's a button on the homepage to add in your comments. And next week, we're going to continue on with ethics. Okay, Gary Wood is going to give the second of these two talks. The title of his talk is Ethics of Science Informing Theology. And, please join us. I tried to put that up, but I'm afraid that if I actually push this PowerPoint thing, I have no idea what's going to happen. But anyway, the title of his talk is Ethics of
Artificial
Science
Intelligence
Informing
at Work.
Theology. And so thank you all. And, we'll just leave this on a while, but I think any of you who are thinking about leaving and just, push the red button and you're off the air. But if, we don't need to end here. And if people want to stay on and talk some more about these topics, they can certainly do that. But